thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to have a chance to join you all and ask questions of Ambassador Roy, who has been an example to all of us, an instructor to all of us, somebody I've really learned from over the years, and in recent years I've been based in China to become more and more, I guess not full dimension of friendship, but I've really enjoyed seeing you there. And I thought what I'd do, we have 30 minutes for this session. I'm going to spend the first 15 or 20 or so asking a series of questions about political transitions in China, economic developments there, relationships between China and the United States, and then we'll have at least 10 minutes or so for questions for all of you. It is interesting to think that back in 1992, when you were on duty in Beijing, is that right? That was the last time we had a simultaneous transition of leadership between the United States and the Chinese government. And it was the fun couple of Bill Clinton and Jiang Zemin who were taking over controls then. Interesting to see Bill Clinton back on the stage now as the most effective advocate for Barack Obama, and Jiang Zemin being introduced as sort of the eminence grise with black hair of the Chinese leadership. I wonder if we could start by talking about, and when we see the contrast in these transitions, everything transparent to a fault in the American transition, everything opaque to an extreme degree in the Chinese transition. I'd like to talk about short and long-term political transitions issues in China. Let's start with the short term. How much do we know about the transition that's actually happening now? Who will be in the standing committee? Whether Xi Jinping will really be in control? Tell us how we should think about the news of the next week or two out of this transition in China.
Very quickly. Every 10 years in China, you have a big transition because they now have a sort of two-term system where the top leaders get 2 5-year terms and then they have to move on. So this is one of those transitions, and that means that 7 of the 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo have to be replaced because China has age limits. If you're 68 years old, you cannot be re-elected to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. That means you're out. 67, you can run. The 25-person Politburo will lose 14 members. That's about 40% of the Politburo. So think of a turnover in the U.S. government that would represent that large a turnover. It's significant for that reason. There's a second reason why it's significant. Because look at the generational factor in each of the groups of leaders who have led China. Jiang Zemin was the predecessor to Hu Jintao. Jiang Zemin was of a generation of Chinese leaders who were educated in the Soviet Union. Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao was the premier, who was stepping down. They were the Cultural Revolution group of leaders. They had no opportunity to study abroad. They had very limited knowledge of the outside world when they moved into their top positions. Xi Jinping, who's expected to be the new General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and will become the president next March when the National People's Congress meets, is the first generation of leaders who have come of age, if you will, during the period of reform and openness in China. That means that over 33 years of Xi Jinping's experience has been when China was much more open to the outside world. His daughter is studying at Harvard University. He's the first Chinese leader since Sun Yat-sen who actually knows something about the United States. He visited here 25 years ago. He's made 5 visits to the United States at a private capacity or in a government capacity at a lower level, so that he actually understands our country and he can find out about dating patterns in Cambridge and how American young people think from his daughter at the dinner table. Now, what does that mean in terms of our bilateral relationship? Well, of course, we don't know. But we have to assume that this change in leadership, because the new leaders are 12 to 15 years younger than their predecessors, will have a different outlook on the world and on how to deal with problems in China. This is very similar to Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, who was misread because people assumed that he was just another apparatchik produced by the uniformity of the Soviet system. But he was 20 to 25 years younger than Brezhnev, than Andropov, than Chernenko, who were the 3 leaders that preceded him. And he brought a generational change to the concept of how to deal with the problems of the Soviet Union, and you know the consequences. Well, that's why this is an important leadership transition in China. But there's another reason why it really matters to us. In many ways, our biggest foreign policy challenge as a nation is managing our relations with China. Because we are caught in a problem that historians are fascinated by. We have a large, rising power who is, in a sense, challenging our position in the Pacific, and we are the established power. And in the past, this type of confrontation has led to war. But we don't want war with China, and China doesn't want war with us. And so the question is, can our leaders prevent that pattern, which is rooted in human nature and the competition that arises between ambitious upstarts when they get stronger and more powerful and want to be more assertive? All of us who have teenage children are familiar with the pattern. So the question is, can it be managed effectively? And that's something that President Obama and President Xi Jinping in China are going to have to set as a very important foreign policy goal. If they ignore the problem, we are heading for trouble with China. If they address the problem, they have to see if there's a way of developing a new type of relationship between China and the United States in which we can balance cooperation and competition. Now, the language I have just stated is from a speech by Secretary Clinton, which was echoed by a speech by China's top foreign policy official, Dai Bingguo, who are both talking about finding a new relationship in which you can balance cooperation and competition and break the iron law of history, in Dai Bingguo's words, that dooms rising powers to end up in confrontation with established powers. So a lot rests on what comes out of this party conference.
You've given us a lot to work with. I'm going to want to come back to what you were just talking about either the inevitability or the avoidability of competition. I want to go back to the comparison we made with Gorbachev. Because I want to press, what are you saying, on the one hand, that this is an example of where generational differences have made an underappreciated difference, or are you saying, in a more sort of explicit way, that you think reform of that sort is a reasonable expectation during the time coming with Xi Jinping and his generation of leaders?
I was saying the former, but I agree with the latter.
And so make that case. So to set this up for a second, outside friends of China would certainly wish it to open up, to have the political system catch up with the maturity of the population, the maturity of the economic system, the maturity of the people, and yet there is so much evidence of the lagging indicator of the political system, the tensions within it, the fact that there's a situation of permanent emergency in Beijing, there's always some reason for special security crackdowns. Why do you think the forces of reform actually might prevail?
Think of it this way. Reform and openness in China began in 1979. So we're talking about 33 years during which China has been pursuing these policies. During the first 10 years, from 79 to 89, China was changing very rapidly. It was going from the closed, repressive system of the Cultural Revolution into an open system, full diplomatic relations with the United States, rapidly building relations with the international community. And it turned out that China had an unstable domestic situation for handling that. So in one 10-year period, you had a purge of 2 general secretaries of the Communist Party. In a 10-year period. And the Communist Party general secretary is the most powerful figure, or is supposed to be, in China. So then Tiananmen hit in 1989. And then China had to go through a wrenching 3-year period when the Soviet Union collapsed, leading people around the world, and some people in China, to think that communism was doomed around the world, and that the Chinese system might collapse along with the Soviet system. And China had become an international pariah because of the negative reaction to Tiananmen around the world. So 3 years marked internal struggle in China over what its future course should be. And then in 1992, Deng Xiaoping made a trip to the south of China, where they had set up these special economic zones to introduce free market principles on a very limited basis to see how it would work in China. And he said this is a good thing, and that helped turn the tide in Beijing. And when Beijing held its 14th Party Congress, this is the 18th Party Congress, they have the 14th Party Congress in 1992, they swept out the hardliners who had gained a foothold after Tiananmen and went back aggressively on the reform and openness policy. But they didn't only do that, they reformed the Communist Party ideology. They essentially took Marxism and threw it out the window. The Communist Party in China is not the Communist Party that Marx would recognize. They have redefined who they represent. They represent the advanced productive forces, that means capitalists. They represent the advanced social forces, that means scientists, intelligentsia, artists, people like that. And they represent the whole people. In other words, there's no class structure for the Communist Party. And then comes along Hu Jintao, and he declares the goal of having a harmonious society. Hey, just a minute. If you've read the Communist Manifesto, the goal of communism is class struggle. That's the motive force of history. And yet the head of the Chinese Communist Party talks in terms of promoting a harmonious society. Well, what these changes did was they created a stable basis in China for China to grow at a 10% average rate per year over the last 2 decades. But that has transformed the nature of China. It's created large middle classes. It's created a generation of young people who think totally differently from their elders because they have been exposed to the outside world. They're part of the internet generation. And if China doesn't change, they're not going to be able to maintain domestic stability, in my judgment. And I think that China's new leaders recognize this. So the problem in China is not whether they have to make change. It's whether they can make change, preserving stability, and having the changes significant enough so that they can retain a stable base for continued economic growth. If they can't do that, then the days of the communist system in China are going to be numbered, and that's not going to be good for anybody, because a chaotic transformation to a new political system in China would create human misery on a scale that nobody should welcome, and it would also create dangerous international complications. So this is a big stake game that the new leaders will inherit. They've got to make changes. The world is watching them. The Chinese people are demanding it, and yet it's not easy to do when you're dealing with a host of country-sized units. We've just had the Europeans here talking. China has 3 provinces that are larger than Germany, which is the largest country in Western Europe.
In people, if I cover it.
I'm talking in terms of population. The governor of Guangdong province has a population of 103 million people in one province. So don't think of this as U.S. states in China. This is a qualitative difference flowing from the quantitative size of China's provinces. California, our most populous state, we're ranked number 17 in China in terms of the size of its population. So this is a country where managing these territorial units is a major challenge. And China's senior leaders have generally gone through the process of managing 1 or 2 of these units as part of moving up to the top to a highly competitive system where ability counts and relationships count. So that doesn't mean necessarily the best person always reaches the top, but the people who do reach the top are highly experienced and have held major responsibilities before they assume the top positions. This is a key difference between their system and our system.
There's a whole different scale. They're experienced in a certain way. For example, you wouldn't say that Hu Jintao is highly experienced in the world, or these have that they're very good attuned here. But let me just press one bit more on this transition issue, whether when you say to this audience that there is something about the Gorbachev example, we hear that as a good thing. Of course, many Chinese people say that as the worst thing you could say because the current Russia is half the size.
Gorbachev is the villain in Chinese minds because he lost control of the process and the system collapsed as a result.
The country broke up.
And they want to avoid it.
Right. So therefore, you're saying they have to find a way to adjust because the consequences otherwise are so dire. What will be the signs you are looking for that they either are doing that or are not?
This is a much more complicated question because in the old days, you had a dominant leader who could impose policies on his colleagues if he wished to, although sometimes it required struggles like the Cultural Revolution in order to succeed in doing so. But China really has a collective leadership now. So, for example, was Fujitao reformed? We'll never know. Because we know that there were people on the standing committee of the Politburo who didn't want reform. And if you're on the standing committee of the Politburo, you could block reform because of the position you occupy. So to get reforms, you have to be able to develop consensus among the new group that emerges. Now, this party Congress is going to produce this new group. In the past two party Congresses, we've had 9 people at the very top on the standing committee of the Politburo. Now the rumor is they're going to reduce the group to 7 people. Well, 2 of them we know reasonably well. One is Xi Jinping, who just visited the United States in January, and the other is Li Keqiang, who's going to be the new premier. But we don't know who the other 5 people are going to be. And that's what we need to watch. The one thing we do know is they will probably come from the Politburo, the existing Politburo, and we know who the principal candidates are, but we don't know which are the ones who are going to make the cut. And that will be important, because some of them are known for reformist ideas, and some of them are known for not having reformist ideas. And therefore the balance on the new leading group is going to be very important in terms of the policies that China will pursue, particularly domestically, but it may spill over into international affairs also.
I have 2 other questions I'd like to ask you in the 5 minutes before we go to audience questions. One involves the military. I'm sure at World Affairs Councils around the country, people have heard a lot about the South China Sea tensions over the past year, about the apparent aggressiveness or assertiveness of the Chinese military the year before that, new stealth fighter, et cetera, et cetera. What would you urge people here to say about the Chinese military, the balancing power in the Pacific, the South China Sea tensions to their constituents? What's the main way to think about this military relationship with China?
Urge people to really look into the issue. It's very hard to understand how we should be reacting to China's military. Think of it this way. China has been so weak for most of the last 150 years, it hasn't been able to defend itself. In the 19th century, all of China's wars were fought inside China's borders, or during the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, it was large. The land battles were fought in North Korea. That was under Chinese suzerainty at the time. During the 20th century, China's wars were all fought on the borders of China, or inside China in the form of civil war. So that you had the Sino-Indian dispute in 1862, the war. You had the border clashes with the Soviet Union in 1969. You had the lessons of Vietnam in 1979. And you had the Korean War in 1950 to 1953. Now China is 15 times richer than it was before. So it has value. In the past, it was so poor that Chinese missiles were actually targeted on Chinese soil because that's where they expected the enemy to be. Now, China can't afford to have that sort of a situation anymore, so China has to be able to defend its territory. But its wealth is largely concentrated in the coastal provinces. So that means that China has to be developing defensive capabilities to protect its coastal provinces. But we, the United States, ever since the Battle of Midway in 1943, have essentially had air and naval dominance in the Western Pacific. So if China develops a better capability to protect its own territory and wealth, it's going to end up either eroding American dominance or creating a competition of military capabilities that will suck up resources from both countries in an endless spiral. So the question is there a way to find a process for stabilizing this so that China can have greater confidence about the ability to defend itself, while the United States can remain strong enough so we can defend our interests in the Western Pacific and be seen as a reliable ally by the key countries that depend on us as an ally, and that includes South Korea and Japan. Now, maybe that middle ground doesn't exist, but if we don't explore that question, then we are going to be letting history repeat itself. We're going to be getting into an endless spiral of competition with China, and our, frankly, current financial circumstances don't put us in a good situation to take that on. Why? Do you remember the statements that Ronald Reagan spent the Soviet Union into bankruptcy because he increased defense spending and the Soviets couldn't keep up? I don't think that's why the Soviet Union collapsed, but there's no question that the Russians couldn't compete with us in terms of the size of military budgets. We have China now with a purchasing parity GDP of around 11.5 trillion. And the United States has a GDP of about 15 trillion. At China's current rate of growth, it has the potential to overtake us in terms of the absolute size of its GDP within 4 or 5 years. So that means, do we want to have an endless military competition with China having potentially an ability to outspend us on defense?
I will bet you it does not overtake the U.S. within 4 or 5 years. Will you take that bet?
No. First of all, we have a new leadership in China. And secondly, clearly, if the United States economy restores a process of healthy growth, that will affect the length of time for China to overtake us. And thirdly, we don't know whether China is going to be able to sustain its growth. But an interesting thing at this party congress, the General Secretary Hu Jintao, who's about to step down, just gave a report. And in it, he referred to China's goal of doubling per capita income in China from 2010 until 2020. Now, since China's population growth is relatively stable, given its size of 1.3 billion, that really means that China has to double the size of its GDP in a 10-year period. To do that, China has to grow at a rate of at least 9 to 10%. But China's economy is now the second largest in the world. And keeping an economy that large growing at 9 to 10% is extremely difficult.
Although 7% compounded would do it, wouldn't it? But anyhow,
no, I did the math.
I'm saying if there were no compounding, it would take 10%.
If there were no, 10% with compounding means that China could double its GDP in about 7 years.
Anyhow, we can take this offline. I'll give you one other question that the main lesson I took in trying to talk to audiences in China is that in America is that they should take China seriously but not be afraid of it. I think the fear of China would be a distorting force here. What would be, with your much vaster experience, what's the main message you give to American audiences how they should think about China?
We are in a more favorable position vis-a-vis China in virtually every aspect of national power. We have a highly educated population, we have a favorable geographic position, we are rich in natural resources, we have the best military in the world, we have the best cyber technology in the world, we have the best higher education system in the world, we far outpace China in terms of the strength of our cultural and soft power around the world. You can go on and on and on. And you know what I'm quoting in saying this? I'm quoting a study by a conservative Chinese think tank that looked at the elements of national power and found that the United States in 10 out of 15 areas was way ahead of China. What's the difference? Our system is underperforming and China's system is overperforming. That's our problem. So if we want to address this question of China overtaking us, the message I would send to all of you, and I would send to the U.S. government, is we have to get our domestic house in order, because then we don't have to fear a rise in China. But if we continue to have an underperforming political and economic system, then China's rise could pose very difficult problems for us in both security, political, and economic spheres.
And indulge me, one more follow-up, and I'll bring all of you in. I entirely endorse the Let's Reform America agenda. Is it not inevitable that a country with 4 times as many people as we have is going to overtake the size of our economy? And we only have to become 1/4 as rich as we are to have a larger economy. Shouldn't we accept that as something that should happen?
Yes, unless we have an immoral foreign policy. I mean, our foreign policy shouldn't be to preserve our position by keeping other countries from improving the livelihoods of their people. We want an international system where countries can improve the livelihood of their system, of their people, but can still not reflect a security danger for the United States. What does that require? Responsible behavior. And so therefore the goal of our policy with China should be to encourage China to be a responsible major power as opposed to a ambitious, expansive, demanding, assertive world power. Now the problem is that rising countries all show those bad characteristics, and we were no exception. If you read U.S. history, study it, the period of the Spanish-American War, we were assertive, demanding, we wanted to be domineering in our region, we threatened war twice with European countries over issues in the Caribbean, we took on a war with Spain that we didn't have to fight, and then we took over Philippine colonies, etc. China is showing identical instincts. But here's the difference. European countries looked at the United States rising and said, uh-oh, this is a problem. We should do something about it. But when they looked at it, they found they had nothing to work with. We were already the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere because of the collapse of the European colonial system. Did you form an alliance with Canada and Mexico against the United States? Not very good policy. So they ended up not trying to hold us down, and we didn't destabilize our region because we were already the dominant power. Now look at China. It has all the same instincts the United States had when we were rising, but it's surrounded by big, strong countries. India, Russia, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam. The United States is a permanent factor in the region. Many of those countries have nuclear weapons, and all of them have historical grievances with China. And if China behaves in an assertive fashion, they show solidarity with the United States. So this is China's foreign policy problem. If it behaves irresponsibly, it immediately delivers negative consequences for China. Whereas if it behaves responsibly, the growth of its economy has been benefiting all of the other economies in East Asia, and they all want to get along with China. So therefore the incentives for China to behave responsibly are strong. And it should be the goal of our foreign policy not to contain China, but to take advantage of this dynamic so that China's own self-incentives will be to behave responsibly. That's not going to be easy, but if foreign policy was easy, I would have chosen some other line of work.
Thank you both for this discussion. I'm Maria Zaman with the World Affairs Council of Greater Hampton Roads. It's good to see you again. Our speaker a while back.
Great being here.
Yeah. My question is a riff on the military issue, and I have read often that there's a tension between the political and military establishments, with the military having its own power base, and their, questionable control by the political leadership over the military leadership. And I wonder if you could address that issue.
The concept of the party controlling the gun is a basic tenet of Chinese communist thinking. But the mechanisms that the party uses to control the military are less effective in dealing with a big, strong, modernized military. And one of the biggest concerns for outside countries like us, or for Japan, or Russia, or India is we don't fully understand how Chinese military behavior is coordinated. So if an incident involving Chinese naval ships, for example, in the South China Sea occurs, We don't know whether that reflects a military action or whether it reflects a national action that was approved by China's top political leadership. So this is a problem. And China itself isn't completely certain how to deal with it. China is very unusual. The loyalty of the army is not to the country, of the military, it's to the party. And that's built in the party statute. But here's the problem in rising countries. Rising countries generate nationalism, which is essentially love of country. And so love of country then undermines the concept of loyalty to the party on the part of the military instead of to the country. And there are clear signs in China that the party's worried about this. And so they are constantly stressing that the concept of loyalty to the party by the military is absolutely essential. Now, on big issues, we think that there is control. The chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is the top military policy body in China, is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. But most of the time, he's the only civilian on that commission, and all of the others are what we would call four-star generals, which means it's not exactly easily weighted in order to have civilian control. But China has a political commissar system that extends throughout the military. The commissars don't interfere with military operational decisions. What they determine is whether you get promoted or you get promoted. Well, that is a pretty effective power system. But is it enough to deal with a nationalistic issue such as an island dispute with Japan, in which Chinese people feel passionately about it? If the military insists on doing something, is the party going to be strong enough to hold it back? These are the questions that we worry about and don't know the answers as well as we should.
You have time for one or two more quick rounds of questions. Back in the back.
My name is Jay Brunt. I'm from the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. My question has to do with a policy, domestic policy question for the Chinese, and that is the environment. I've been struck in talking with, admittedly, a very few young people, young Chinese, who are really sad about the environmental degradation that they've seen in their own communities. And I'm wondering, is that a widely held view? And if it is it something that the leadership feels that they have to address? Because, of course, if they do, it will probably have ramifications for their economic growth.
You've raised a very important issue. It's one of enormous and growing concern inside China. It's not simply the pollution, which is affecting health on a massive scale in China. When you come out with lists of the most polluted cities in the world, there are a shocking number of Chinese cities that are in the top group. So it's not only air pollution and environmental damage, but particularly in North China, the problem of clean water is on a massive scale. Current estimates are that there are over 300 million people in China, that's the population of the United States, that way, who have difficulty getting access to clean water. And they have a gigantic project to try to take water from southern rivers and send it by canals up to North China in order to deal with the problem. And I talked to a top government official, the chairman of the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences, of Engineering Sciences, about the program, and he said, privately, it would actually make more sense to take northern people and move to the south than to try to move southern water and move it to the north. Probably some Californians would agree with that, but I don't know. In any event, the environmental issue is a really serious problem for China. It has health consequences that are affecting China across the board. My wife, who does not have asthma, when she goes to Beijing, she has asthma and can't breathe. I mean, it's literally that bad.
So actually, why don't we have, if you state your question and you state your question, then you can answer them back to back.
Bill Clifford of World Boston. It seems that on January 20th, you won't be labeling China a currency manipulator as a facet of our dealing with economic competitiveness. But the language that we use, strategic rival, partner, competitor, is it helpful to try and classify a country in phrases? And do the Chinese do the same toward us? And Jim, you once wrote a book, More Like Us, pertaining to Japan, kind of prescriptive about how can we align? What's your assessment?
We'll both take those under advisement. Yes, from the back.
Okay, my name is Phil Mwamba from West Palm Beach. Ni hao, jiao ma fei li. And my question is, I'm studying international business and I'm getting ready to go to China hopefully next year. Do you have any advice for me to be successful there?
Good. So, language of competition, advice for business success. I turn the floor over to you.
Very good question. Essentially, you shouldn't deal with big, powerful, complex countries or relationships through the use of labels. You simply can't summarize China through a label. The currency manipulation issue potentially is an important issue, and in the case of China, it simply isn't. Here are the facts. First of all, the president doesn't make the determination. The Secretary of the Treasury does. That's under law. So I think if Governor Romney had been elected, he would have found on his first day that he had a problem. He either had to have the Democratic holdovers make the determination for him, or he wouldn't have a Treasury Secretary in place to make the recommendation. But he's been saved that.
That was one of several holes in this
agenda. But here are the facts. China's currency since 2005 has appreciated by about 30%. That's big appreciation. It has not had much impact on the U.S. trade deficit with China. Is the U.S. trade deficit with China important? No, not particularly important. If you look at our overall trade deficit, China is only one part of it. And the reason why China's trade deficit surplus with us is so great is because all of the Asian countries that used to have trade surpluses with us have moved their manufacturing facilities to China, and the consolidated trade surplus is now coming from China, but it actually represents the manufacturing processes that used to be spread around many countries. In other words, trade statistics as they are calculated now on a basis that fit the 19th century are no longer appropriate. While I was sitting here listening to the earlier speakers, I took out my cell phone, which is a Motorola. It said assembled in China. All of the parts of that cell phone were imported to China. The value added in China was probably 5% of the value of the phone, but when it was exported back to the United States, China got 100% of the value of the phone. Frankly, calculating trade statistics that way is incorrect, and economists don't like to talk about it because they haven't done their homework to see if in a computerized age whether we can come up with a better way of calculating these things. We have very serious trade problems with China. And the one that does get some attention, the intellectual property theft, is a real problem. And any American company who wants to invest in China has to worry about how they protect their intellectual property. But a lot of the other ones that matter don't get much attention. The question of access to China's market against a growing number of areas that have been declared strategic areas and therefore blocked for foreign investment. Getting national treatment in China so that American investors in China have the same treatment under Chinese law as Chinese companies do. Under WTO rules, they should have equal treatment. In practice, they don't have it. So we have lots of trade issues we have to pursue with China, but we have excellent trade mechanisms for dealing with it, including the strategic and economic dialogue, which puts our top officials together to raise these sorts of issues. So I would say, don't deal with China in terms of labels, don't deal with it in terms of currency manipulation or trade imbalance, but keep attention on the areas where we are not getting the fair treatment that we deserve under the international trade rules that China has agreed to. On the question of what would my advice be for investing in China, it would be careful, read some very good recent books that have been written on this. There are 2 books by Jim McGregor, who has spent a lot of time in China. His most recent one has a name I cannot possibly remember because it's based on a strange Chinese saying, but it is filled with advice on how to do business in China. Earlier, he had one called 1 Billion Customers, which also, at the end of each chapter, is filled with do's and don'ts in terms of doing business with China. It's those sorts of books that can give you very good practical advice on how to avoid the pitfalls that have snared many foreign investors who have moved in too ambitiously and too rapidly without having done their homework.
So my 1 second addendum to this part addressed me is that when I was living in Japan, my main recommendation to Americans was that the way we will do best in the world is being most like ourselves. The openness, the mobility, the equality, the opportunity, the confidence, the forward-lookingness of the United States. I think that's the same case when it comes to China more later. We can ask
I want to add one thing. You should also read James Fallows' book about the Chinese aircraft industry, which is the best study of the Chinese aircraft industry you can find.
And it's a proxy for whether China is going to make it overall. And so we could ask 1,000 more questions, but please join me in thanking Ambassador.